So I'm Matt Reed. I'm the CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation. The Aga Khan Foundation is one of 3 organizations that owns this building, the Aga Khan Center. So welcome to the Aga Khan Center, which has been our home now for a little over 5 years. If you don't know much about the Aga Khan Foundation or the Aga Khan Development Network, we're a collection of 9 development agencies working on economic, social, and cultural development in Central and South Asia, Eastern Africa, a little bit in the Middle East. Our institutions go back 120 years. So if you want to talk about long-term development, some of the first Aga Khan institutions, schools, now preschools, hospitals, were founded 120 years ago in Kutch, in India, and in Zanzibar, and have now grown across a whole range of areas and now a whole range of entities. Across all of our agencies, we want to do 3 things. So the first is that we are trying to help improve the quality of life in all its dimensions for all the people who are in the areas where we happen to be located. The second is that we promote pluralism. So wherever we work with and on behalf of everyone. Sunni, Shia, Hindu, Muslim, tribal, Christian, I mean, you name it. The whole point of what we do is to create a platform and bridges for people to come together. And that brings us to the third thing that we do, is that we try to promote civil society or self-reliance. So I think you will understand from those 3 themes why the theme of this book and this panel is so important to us. It is quite literally in our DNA. When His Highness the Aga Khan founded the Aga Khan Foundation, one of the first things that he did was put in place a platform for consulting communities. Consulting communities, forming community groups and organizations that are representative of everyone in those places and that come together to talk about and prioritize their own needs and development. And then our goal is to work with them and help empower them to really take charge of their own development. We've been doing that in those parts of the world as the foundation for the last, say, 40 plus years. So that, I think, gives you a sense of why this topic is important to us, why I'm so pleased that so many of you are here, and I'm looking forward, and we're looking forward to learning from all of you and learning about the many, many good examples of work along these lines in the book. So I'll stop there, and I'll hand it over to Matt Reeves to talk a little bit more about the panel and this evening. Thanks a lot.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for an incredibly timely conversation about the recently published book, Community-Led Development in Practice, We Power Our Own Change. This evening we're going to be hearing from the editors of the book, and we're also going to be hearing from the authors of 2 of the book's chapters. So to kick us off today, I would like to invite the editors and indeed the instigators of Community-Led Development in Practice to take the stage. So I'm going to be inviting Elene Cloete, who's the Senior Director for Research and Advocacy for Outreach International, and she's joining us today, having traveled from Atlanta in the US. So please, Elene. And Elene will be joined by her co-editor, Gunjan Veda, who is the Global Secretary for the Movement for Community-Led Development, which is a majority world-led network of networks with over 2,000 local organizations and their allies. Unfortunately, Gunjan is not able to be here in person today, so she's joining us virtually from Washington, D.C. Please welcome Elene and Gunjan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you also, Matt, for hosting us here at the Aga Khan Foundation today. We are so happy to be here, and we are so happy to be here even though we are very far from one another, Gunjan. Um, it's so wonderful for us to talk about the book. It is a project that is very close to both of our hearts because it speaks to something that is really meaningful to us, because it's the work that we do and the work that we believe in, and also the work that motivates us to continue doing what we are doing. Gunjan, and so you are virtually with us, and that is actually also how all of this started, eh?
Yeah, it is. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but then, as Elene said, it started with us. It's almost fitting because the story of the book and our story together, I would say, Elene and my story together, right, started virtually. So, just to give you a little bit of a background, go back a few years, Matt already introduced the movement. We are a majority world-led network of networks. That's a mouthful, I know, but we deliberately chose that because the majority world is a way for us to remind ourselves and everybody else that what people typically call the global south is where the majority of the world's population is, right? So we are a network of 2,000 local and community-based organizations and their INGO allies like Outreach International, which Elene is a part of. And we are committed to ensuring that every person has a voice and choice in decisions that affect their lives. So we will launch in 2015 in Malawi, actually, in May. So this is our 10th year. We have a big celebration happening in May, virtually. Everybody is invited. But if you think back a little bit, right, if you think back to the pre-COVID world of 2019, and if you try to remember that time, community-led development, when we spoke about it with anybody, the response was always like, yeah, it sounds wonderful. What is the evidence that it works, right? Because this is before, the pandemic saw a lot of international organizations parachuting out and recognizing communities are first responders in a crisis. But this is before that. This is also before the huge commitments and conversations we began to see around locally led development, around shifting power happening in our sector. So at that time, the question was always, what is the evidence? And I don't know how many people here know this, but 10%, 11% actually of the World Bank's portfolio happens through community-driven development programming. They have a CDD division. And it was interestingly the World Bank that came to the movement at that time and said, everybody is asking for evidence. Let's face it, the World Bank doesn't really, do community-led development, right? It's NGOs that do it. So why don't you guys come up with an evidence? And that's how I joined the movement. And I was like, where do I find the evidence, right? And obviously in our evaluation reports, those shiny reports that we keep in our offices and never look at again for the most part, we looked at those reports. I think within a week, we got 400 when we asked people for it, all from our INGO members, because local organizations didn't have money to do evaluations. Well, we had a problem. We looked at these reports and we suddenly realized that there's nothing that says these programs are community-led. How do we even know these programs are community-led? So we asked our members, but what makes these programs community-led? And then they turned around and asked us, well, what do you mean by a community-led program? Right? So here we are, a network which has been there for all these 4 years, talking about community-led development, saying we do community-led development, wanting to shift the way the world does development, and recognize that there is no common understanding, even between ourselves, of what community-led development is. And so we said, well, we need to co-create this. So we reached out, over 100 people from all over the world joined the effort to unpack, right? So we had a lot of discussions, debates, conversations. You know how practitioners, trying to bring practitioners from different countries, time zones, different times of the day to agree on certain common elements is an interesting journey unto itself. We had all of that happen over 2.5 years. And I want to actually give a shout out because I think we have Nazneen in the room, Nazneen Kanji in the room, right? And Nazneen was one of our advisors for this process as we were going through this. But we went through all of this after 2.5 years of a lot of literature review, discussion, debate, consultation. we came up with a few things. We came up with a report on what do people do when they say they are doing CLD, right? So we looked at 175 programs across 63 countries. We came up with a participatory CLD assessment tool, which kind of is the frame for this book that we have now. So we'll come back to it. And then we came up with another tool on how do we ensure that when we are thinking about evaluations, we ensure that they are true to the principles of CLD. But we did all of this, and it's relevant here because that's how Elene and I met, because the pandemic hit and Elene joined one of our calls virtually, and then she became a part of our collaborative research team, right, Elene? And our journey of debate and discussion started there. But then the book, we released the tools in Jan 2021, Elene, which is when you came up with this idea of, but this is not enough. So why? Why did you want to do the book?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So as Gunjan was saying, we were a lot of representatives from different organizations working in these working groups. At that time, we started to say, okay, we have some things that we have in common, and these can constitute what is community development. But then I connected with Gunjan and said, okay, we've done a lot of work up until now, but what is perhaps still lacking is examples of all of this. Right? Do we have enough case studies? Do we have enough summaries, for lack of a better word, of what this looks like in practice? Because a lot of times, I think students of community development and practitioners of community development that do development in a particular way, but become curious of what community-led development looks like, they would have the natural question, all right, this is great. From a theoretical standpoint, you have now told us what is community development, but what does it look like? On the ground, when it happens, what does it look like? And that is then when I reached out to Gunjan and said, maybe we should speak to that particular gap. How about you and I reach out to some of our colleagues in different organizations, in different spaces in the community-led world, in the sector, and let's hear from them whether they would be interested in coming together with us and putting this project together, which is a volume of what community-led development looks like in practice. Gunjan. And that then started for us this initiative that is this project. And I can speak a little bit too on how we ended up choosing or who we ended up connecting with, because it wasn't a case of choosing necessarily Gunjan, it was more a case of seeing people, reaching out to them, and then without hesitation, they would say, absolutely, we want to be part of this project. But when it came to limiting the scope a little bit, we had in mind people working and in spaces in the majority world. We wanted that to be the scope of the work. We also wanted to be very strategic in seeking out authors and connecting with authors that can speak to the practitioner world of things, you know, because a lot of times in volumes like this, you have a particular type of person writing the volume. And then often you would think, okay, are they writing on behalf of other people? And to what extent are they telling only other people's stories through their lens? And so we wanted to incorporate academics into the book, which we did. We wanted to incorporate the voices of INGO practitioners into the book, but then we also wanted to incorporate voices and representation of community-based organizations, leaders into the book, so that they are present, so that they can also talk to what community development looks like in practice. So that was the goal, right? To what extent can we focus and have a book that speaks to what community development looks like in practice? Narrow our scope to majority case studies, majority world case studies, and see to what extent we can have a diverse group of authors being involved in this project. But then, Gunjan, we were thinking, all right, so we will have this collection of chapters and this collection of representatives from different spaces around the majority world. How do we structure this into a book? And then we thought, well, we just happen to have a framework, right?
Absolutely. So and this is where the research that I was telling you about came into place, because we were like doing it. We had done it for 2.5 years. We had spent 2.5 years arriving at the frame of what is CLD. And this was the time for us to test it out and see, how does this apply with all different types of organizations, right? Because we know community-led development happens in various forms in many parts of the world. It's not something new, right? It's not a new thing which has just started off. It's been there for a very, very long time in different forms. It's just been on the margins. So we wanted to see what is the applicability of this framework. And the interesting thing for us was actually, Elene, if you remember, many of the authors of the volume have not been part of MCLD.
Right.
Were not familiar with the frame. And the first
Right.
time when we introduced them to the frame, Matt, for instance, right, for Aga Khan, we had all these sense-making, even Marlo, Philippe, who are there, we had all these sense-making workshops to see, okay, how does this frame look like when you think about community-led development? And it was so interesting for us to note that it did work. Like there was a relevance which was running across the board. So I do want to very quickly share with everybody, and this is the only slide we will use, but I did want to very quickly show people what this frame looks like that we have been using and that the book is structured around. So through that process of debate, discussion, literature review, 2.5 years, we identified 7 characteristics of community-led development and 2 processes that we felt, right, and we saw were integral whenever we thought about community-led development. And those became the 9 dimensions that you see on the screen. And these 9 dimensions, when you look at the book, right, the book is actually structured around these 9 dimensions. So every chapter in the book speaks specifically to how do you operationalize one of these dimensions? What are the challenges, right? What are some of the learnings that different types of organizations have had when they have tried to operationalize them, right? And how these are all interconnected, because even though every chapter speaks to one dimension in terms of the operationalization, when you hear the story, you actually see how all of these others come into play, right? So what were these 9 dimensions? And I think a lot of you would find these of no surprise, to be no surprise. Participation, inclusion, and voice, the core of all our programming, I would say, especially if you think about CLD. We all want to do it, but also it's one of the most difficult things to do. Inclusion, intentional inclusion is such a difficult journey. I think a lot of chapters in the book, be it, from Nagaland in Northeast India to other parts of the world that we have, actually exemplify the Guatemala project, Engineers Without Borders, how difficult the process of inclusion and participation can be. But what are some of the ways in which we can do this, right? Local knowledge and resources. We all know that's the heart of community-led development. Recognizing, celebrating, respecting the knowledge, the relationships, the time, the effort, everything which is in local communities. Sustainability, again, a buzzword in our sector, but also recognizing that sustainability looks different, right? And Elene, to me, this is also the story of growth for us, because you see on the screen sustainability and exit strategies. And now when I look at it, I cringe, because during our discussions and our learning over this period, we've realized that it's not really exit. You don't exit communities when programs end. You transition. There's still a relationship. It just changes, right? So we have chapters that talk in the book, for instance, from Haiti, about what this transition can look like. And you hear about this from the perspectives of both the INGO, right? But also the local organization, which begins to lead the process. And what does that entail? Accountability, how it is multidirectional, who's accountable to whom, right? Matt's chapter is all about responding to the local context, because we heard, how Aga Khan Foundation and the network works across so many different geographies. But is it the same model that can work everywhere? No. And then collaboration, right? Collaboration both within communities, with other organizations, but with the government and civil society, which I know, Elene, we didn't, and you'll speak to this, I'm sure, a little more about why we decided to focus on civil society. We didn't pick up working with governments or examples of CLD within governments in this, but how that is so important to take this work to scale, right? And these last two things that you see in blue, the two processes, which are so integral to community-led development, facilitation, right? Facilitating participation, facilitating inclusion, facilitating local community leadership and collective action, the quality of that facilitation, the enabling elements, the challenges, and then monitoring and evaluation, which is truly, and I think Philippe and Marlo, we have them, they're here with us today. You have them there with you in person in London. They will speak to it, what does it look like for CLD programs when monitoring and evaluation practices emerge from and respond to community needs? So that's really the frame that we have used for the book. And we found, in our sense making, in everything, that worked, right, Elene? Like what we heard from when we selected the different chapters and the authors, we felt that it worked.
It did very much. And like Gunjan was saying, we brought all the authors together. We had several sessions together and we spoke about these dimensions. And I think, Gunjan, if I have to reflect on the process of us putting the book together, it was such a beautiful learning process also for me, and I'm sure for you as well, in working closely with these organizations in putting their chapters together and working with them as they submitted their chapters. Because in working with them, in reading about their work, it becomes just so clear, and it continues to be clear for me, how all these dimensions are so integrated and they speak with one another the whole time. And that is, if I have to reflect on the process too, that's a lot of times what authors would say. Elene, you want us to speak to this particular dimension, but it's a little bit hard for us. Because when we have to write a chapter around accountability, we also have to mention facilitation. We also have to mention collaboration. We also have to mention, participation, inclusion, and voice. And that was a beautiful process of just realizing, again, Gunjan, how these dimensions are so interwoven with one another and interdependent on one another. I think that would be some of my, or maybe one of my biggest reflection moments in just this confirmation about the interconnectedness of these dimensions, but that these dimensions of what, as a collective, constitutes for me what is community-led development. Gunjan, what was sort of a highlight for you or a reflective moment, thinking back at the project?
So many, I think, every step, like you said, Elene, was a journey. But I think to me, the most beautiful part of it was, just recognizing that we have all these different stakeholders, right? And we see so much of divisiveness in our sector in terms of conversations. There's so much of competitiveness, which is there because for the survival thing. But to actually see the richness that is generated, the learning that is generated when different stakeholders come together and work together, right? Because I think in many ways for us, the process of doing the book was also, could we respect those 9 dimensions? Did we have accountability towards each other, right? Could we actually sustain the engagement of doing this work together? How do we pool together the different knowledge from different parts, be it academia, be it INGOs, but local organizations? I think the most remarkable, the thing I am so proud of about this book is the fact that we have local organizations and community leaders, right, who are authors in this book. And I still remember, Elene, when we first went to Routledge about the book and they were like, but we only publish PhDs. Do your authors all have PhDs? And we were like, sure, they're all PhDs in life. Does that count? Surely, right? But the fact that you have, the One Village Partner Sierra Leone story, like Philomen from that community in Grima in Sierra Leone, telling that story of transformation in their community and how community-led development happened, to me, that was just such a learning, but also so powerful that we can do this. What was yours?
I think for me, it was just this moment of feeling the community, right? So community is such a word, it's all over the book, it's on the cover of the book. But in us working together, we also had a community. And, you know, I reached out to those that we did reach out to. There was just an immediate, yes, we want to do it. You know, a sort of, yes, we want to advocate for this thing that we believe in, which is community-led development. Yes, we want to contribute to a volume through which we can show to the world the value that is and that comes from community-led development. And I think that just that, let's do it kind of sentiment that came through our authors, I think is, I drew a lot of energy from that, Gunjan, and I continue to draw a lot of energy from that, because I think that is within our sector and within community development specifically. Gunjan, I think we have been talking a lot about the book and all the different chapters and whatnot. Maybe we can show a video. Is it time? Maybe we can show a video? And then, Gunjan, we can wrap it nicely up to get people to understand the different chapters and
to hear from the authors themselves.
Exactly.
When you bring together a diverse group of people and pool together their knowledge, their experiences, their learnings, that is what our world needs right now, because no one player or part of the system can actually bring about the transformational changes we are talking about. It requires each one of us. And that is what the book showcases to me, that if we are able to really build on our individual strengths in a collective manner, we can do it.
Our quest and the quest for community-led development was seen by practitioners always as a movement for liberation, as a movement to end colonialism. It's not just a better way to do development.
What we have learned over the years is actually getting ourselves engaged with communities in a different way that build spaces so that they themselves can use their own voice. Community-led development interventions that are adaptable, flexible, and thrive on equity, consensus, and partnership actually empower the community.
Successful projects, they don't look the same. Like when the program seems to be more successful was when the communities took the program and rearranged it in the way that it works for the communities.
Within each of our communities, there's someone who has expertise. But unfortunately, most of these structures usually work in silos. How do you leverage the power within the communities? We know it is there, and that is what our chapter directly feeds into us.
We look at the network in Benin, asking everyone, are you really happy with the way we are implementing development? If you are not satisfied with just one single aspect, you are welcome to MCLD.
There is a need for mutual respect. You need to sort of have equity and pluralism embedded in your approach. Then give priority to the empowering process over the efficient approach. NGOs and project managers love efficiency and sacrifice empowerment at the altar of efficiency. And this says that to create good community organization, empowering is more important than efficiency.
It just so happened that Engineers Without Borders was looking for someone like me to do a project in Guatemala. You know, they wanted to essentially do community-led development. And I was essentially the facilitator for all of this. And I think part of my message is, you know, constant adjustment, more time. And development organizations of whatever size and shape usually don't plan that. The best development is not constricted or constrained by such limitations.
ABCD, or asset-based citizen-led development, addresses the internalized powerlessness and dependency of community members. Realize that they have assets, strengths, and capabilities valuable to their own well-being and the well-being of the whole community.
We were dedicated and committed to community-led development from the beginning. But what we did not realize is the depth of dynamics between the international and the local. Our chapter is about that journey. We wrap up by explaining when we did move out of the way, the successes and progress were enormous.
I thought the constellation SALT approach would work really well. And here we are using it with 12 NGOs in South Asia. So the NGOs are assessing their own progress. And our role is to trust the capacity of people, deeply listen, appreciate, and learn from their experience.
We try to narrate the story of Sarvodaya, its vision, its philosophy, its approach, the model and everything, and to emphasize the spirit of transformation, which is exemplified by the theme that we used, we build the road builds us. Because we try to achieve a physical objective, but in the process, we transform ourselves spiritually and based on our values.
If you have an idea, and you seek out folk with energy, with like-minded energy toward establishing something, you can get things done. It's just possibility. And this for me is just the beginning of such possibilities.
Thank you very much. And so that's just sort of a summary of all the different chapters. It's very, very difficult, obviously, to bring all of those authors with us so that they can talk to each of their chapters respectively. But we are, though, very, very happy that we can hear from Matt directly from the Aga Khan chapter and then eventually also from the Constellation chapter. Thanks, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elene and Gunjan. It was an incredible honor for the Aga Khan Foundation to be approached by the movement for community-led development in the early stages of putting this book together. And we contributed in our chapter towards the issue of responsiveness to different contexts. I want to just talk a little bit about the work of the Aga Khan Foundation, and then we'll see a bit of these contexts. So the Aga Khan Foundation works across an incredibly wide range of activities, and maybe some of you will be familiar with Aga Khan schools, Aga Khan health centers, but one of the key things that really weaves all of that work together is our work in and with communities. We believe that by working with communities, by helping to connect communities, we create the foundation for essentially everything else that we're seeking to do. And that work with communities was very much inspired by the fourth Aga Khan, His Highness Prince Karim, who passed away earlier this year. But he believed and always believed that civil society was one of the most powerful forces in the world, and that as the Aga Khan Foundation, as the Aga Khan Development Network, we should be seeking to vigorously encourage and wisely nurture civil society. So that is very much where this work comes from. And in the early 1980s, we were encouraged to build upon some of these individual institutions that had been created, as Matt said, up to 120 years ago, and to make a commitment to holistic community-led development in Gilgit-Baltistan and Chitral in northern Pakistan, and Gujarat in western India. And maybe some of you are familiar with that work. It was incredibly transformative in those communities, and we do have quite a shiny World Bank evaluation about that work, that then it encouraged us to go and take this approach to other geographies. And so we did. We took what we'd learned in Gujarat and in Gilgit-Baltistan Chitral to the Swahili coast of East Africa, to Syria, to Afghanistan, to even to Portugal, to urban Lisbon and Porto. And in 23, we worked in that year alone with over 20,000 civil society organizations in these places. And so when we were approached, what we wanted to do was sort of understand what happened in each of those contexts. How it, did we just take a model from Pakistan and India and apply it to all these different places? What lessons did we learn through that? And obviously, I'm not the person doing community-led development. My colleagues are. And so in order to create the Aga Khan Foundation's chapter, I reached out to and spoke with colleagues in all of these different places, had conversations with them, and I wanted to bring their voices into the room. So if you forgive me, we have another video, but it's an opportunity to hear from our Aga Khan Foundation colleagues who are on the front line doing this work every day. And so, Ellen, is it just go to the next page and then?
Yes.
Great. And Ellen helped put this video together. I mean, this video would not exist if it wasn't for Ellen. So while she's playing it, so thank you.
Our Khan Rural Support Program is working in Gilgit-Baltistan and Chitral. It's mainly mountainous area with high peaks and glaciers. Due to its specific location, area is also vulnerable to climate challenges.
Development work in Syria faces many challenges, most notably the Syrian crisis and the climate change. This is in addition to security risk, the spread of war remnants, and the fragility of the social fabric.
Of course, we also experience some challenges, especially when it comes to resources, because that is still something that most of these organizations and communities are still struggling.
As atividades com as quais nós trabalhamos estão localizadas sobretudo na periferia. Isto significa que estão longe dos centros urbanos e, por norma, têm um acesso muito mais limitado a uma variedade de recursos e, por consequência, também de direitos. O que eu considero que é essencial para o desenvolvimento comunitário neste contexto, acho que são duas dimensões. Uma é a relação, ou seja, a relação que conseguimos estabelecer com as pessoas, que importa ser sempre uma relação de proximidade e daí de confiança. E a outra dimensão tem a ver com a estratégia, com a metodologia, ou seja, a transformação, a mudança não acontece só por vontade, tem de acontecer porque é inspirada naquilo que as pessoas querem e porque tem um plano e tem uma consequência, tem etapas.
I believe community participation in all stages of project development is necessary and important to success of the program. We engage communities in identifying their problems, designing programs for themselves, and then they are partners in implementing those programs and projects, and they also do the monitoring after completion of the programs.
We also look at things to do with self-reliance, because we don't want to do programs when we go, there's nothing that is happening. We want to see sustainability, and I think when you talk about that, we have actually seen the many programs, the trainings that we have done, the capacity building that creates that self-reliance, something that we're very, very, very proud of as an organization. So we look at this partnership, effective partnership and collaborations that we do with organizations are actually key to the community-led development.
Launching development efforts require building the capacity of relevant institutions and individuals, which Syrian society has lost over the past 14 years, exploring our available resources, developing plans accordingly, and engaging all communities in the planning and implementation of development projects are essential pillars of community-led development. Providing funding is also crucial. Community-led development should be comprehensive and integrated, taking into account all Syrians, especially marginalized groups. Ensuring that all voices are heard contributes to the adoption of community-led development mechanism and contributes to finding more equitable and suitable solutions.
Inclusion, creating a safe space for people to be able to openly share and contribute to the discussions.
O primeiro de todos é o pluralismo e, portanto, perceber que mudança é que toda a gente quer ver acontecer. E esta promoção de encontros improváveis, de pessoas que no cotidiano não se dão, de pessoas que não se conhecem, de pessoas que têm medo umas das outras. O segundo tem a ver com a participação, e a participação é não só esta dinâmica da escuta ativa, não é? E de nós percebermos o que é que as pessoas querem, como entregar e trabalhar as ferramentas que fazem com que as pessoas tracem os planos.
I am inspired by the role of the communities they played in overall development, especially in community organizations where they come together and develop their programs and implement their programs. I'm also inspired by the role played by the community leaders to improve the quality of life of the people living in the area.
In most of our programs that we've done, we have seen the community being so much involved and owning up this program, especially from the local leaders and very strong leadership from the grassroots. That has really contributed to this sustainable development programs that we have seen within our communities.
Ensuring a prosperous future for all Syrians, for children, women, youth, and for elderly has been and will remain a top priority to me. And it inspires me to push community development forward. Syrians deserve to live in dignity and prosperity.
I'm going to read a couple of pages from the book, trying to make sense of how we adapted and how we understood different contexts, right? So, speaking with colleagues from around the world, it was clear that several features of AKF's approach to community-led development do vary with context, shockingly. First, we work with appropriate and flexible institutional designs. They actually all have different names as well. In some contexts, gender equality is advanced by working through separate men's and women's groups. And in other geographies, it's advanced by bringing men and women together. In many places, we find active and trusted civil society organizations already in place, while in others, we need to mobilize communities and nurture organizations from scratch. In certain political contexts, community-led development organizations must be formalized and registered with authorities. And in some contexts, it's appropriate for those organizations to remain unregistered. Second, we experiment with different community-led methods and approaches. Historically, we draw heavily from participatory rural appraisal, including village transect walks and dream mapping, while today we're integrating elements of human-centered design, including empathy interviews and rapid prototyping. Information and communication technology has advanced beyond recognition since we began our community-led development work, and today there are opportunities to connect people via messaging applications, organize data in information management systems, share successes on social media, and raise resources through crowdfunding applications. You can tell how old this book is already because AI is not mentioned. Opportunities for technology use vary massively across our operating context, from urban areas in Lisbon where access is universal to remote communities in Afghanistan, which remain today off the grid. Third, our support teams are structured differently in different contexts. In some geographies, our community support officers are staff of AKF. In others, they are staff of a local partner organization or even community volunteers who are paid a stipend. In some contexts, it's culturally appropriate for female staff to support women's organizations and male staff to support men's organizations, while in others, anyone can cross gender lines to support any organization. In some contexts, we always work directly with local communities, and in others, we engage local NGOs to play a supporting role. We always begin by spending time in communities, listening to the needs, frustrations, and aspirations of diverse community members. By actively listening to everybody in the community, we build rapport and a foundation of trust. We mobilize communities into formal and informal groups with inclusive participation and democratically determined leadership. Together with those groups, we facilitate processes that support communities to surface their needs and identify their priorities for action. We support communities to mobilize resources in support of their goals. The first place we look for resources is within communities themselves. Even if communities don't have their own financial resources, they often have in-kind resources or volunteer time they can bring. Only once we've exhausted internal options do we look externally for support. Communities take leadership of the process, prioritizing needs, identifying and implementing solutions, contributing financial, in-kind and volunteer resources, monitoring change, and creating the conditions for sustainability. We use our convening power to link communities to relevant partners in government, civil society, and private sector to support access to financial and technical resources. Throughout the process, we look for ways to step back and put the community at the center of their own development. Our intention is to provide long-term support and mentorship to groups while avoiding dependency. Beyond approaches, AKF's community-led development is founded upon a set of core values that transcend time and geography and precede conversations around structures and approaches. We believe it is this focus on core values that has enabled AKF to adapt our work in community-led development to diverse and changing contexts. Our long-term focus in specific geographies means we're less tied to specific outcomes, funding streams, and short-term results. Our proximity to communities and the mutual respect that we build enable us to keep our finger on the pulse of what is changing and what really matters to people. Our commitment to equity and pluralism builds a broad base for community support, and our optimistic outlook means that we're always seeking opportunities for communities regardless of the challenges. Although we've had much success, we do not always get it right, and the communities we work with do not consistently thrive. But we're always there alongside them, working together to find solutions to common problems in search for a better quality of life. Moreover, we've seen that investments in community mobilization are never lost in their entirety. Community groups may lie dormant for several years before new opportunities arise to harness our initial investment in social capital. We've witnessed old institutions taking on new forms, and once dormant institutions experience a resurgence as opportunities and circumstances shift. I'd love to invite our next chapter authors to come up onto stage. So we have Marlo de Roo and Philip Forth, and Marlo is a co-founder and a board member, and Philip an ex-board member and board chair and member of the Constellation. Their chapter responds, as we heard earlier, to the monitoring and evaluation component of the book and is titled, Who Owns the Response? How Self-Assessment Catalyzes Ownership. Welcome.
First of all, we are very grateful, Phil and I, for the opportunity here created by Elene and Gunjan first, the space you created with the book, the Aga Khan Foundation for opening this beautiful place, and for all of you who showed up here tonight. It's beautiful weather. The park was also there, but you choose to come here. So thank you so much for this opportunity for us to share and also to learn from one another. Phil and I are here on behalf of the people, communities, colleagues in the Constellation, and especially also on behalf of Ritu Nanda and Mohammad Rafiq, who are the co-authors of this chapter and who actually really drove this chapter. You briefly saw Ritu in the movie. I'm happy that she was there through that. And yeah, we're going to talk about that question, who owns the response? And it was a true pleasure to write this chapter and to think about this question and what have we learned in the Constellation globally on this question.
Okay. I'd just like to mention the Aga Khan a little bit more, because the Constellation has existed for 20 years, a little more than 20 years. And 20 years ago, it received its first partnership, and that was with the Aga Khan. And the Aga Khan trusted us. We were completely new. We had never done anything like this before. And somebody in the Aga Khan, I'm afraid don't know who, said, okay, let's try these people. And from a personal level, we went and worked with the Aga Khan Development Network in Kenya. And we saw a whole range of institutions in Kenya run by the Aga Khan Foundation. And it was amazing. And we'll talk a little bit more about the self-assessment a little bit later on. But I had been involved in developing the self-assessment, working in industry, in oil industry. I'd done self-assessments on production platforms, in oil refineries, and then I got involved with this, and I was asked to go and do self-assessments in Nairobi. And that was truly a life-transforming, I suppose I can say I've been with the Constellation in those following 20 years. I actually found this beautiful booklet that we produced at the end of our project this morning, and it was really delightful just to go and read the contributions of the people.
20 years back,
Yeah. But let's go. Who owns the response is the title of our chapter, and community-led development is the theme of this book. And I think we've spent 20 years really working this idea. It is not obvious. There are a whole range of activities which go within this world of community-led development. And what I'd say is that this range of opinions leads to tensions, that there are different perspectives. And when you start working in communities, there are different understandings about what the community means and what community development means and what community ownership means. So for the Constellation, I think over 20 years, we've developed an awful lot. Our approach, our methodology has changed a lot. But one thing has not changed. We started with this idea that the community owns the response. It's a very strong word when you think about it. And we still have that idea. It has not changed. The methodologies have changed dramatically. But that idea the communities own, it's their response. It's not us. They are in control. And that is a powerful idea. 10 years ago, I was involved with a meeting just down the road at the British Medical Association. We'd been awarded with 10 other NGOs involved in a project with the Gates Foundation to look at immunization. And they brought all of the groups together, and we spent a day talking about it. And at the end of we were on last, or close to last, and I talked about this idea of ownership. And there was a lot of pushback on the idea of ownership in that stage. It was, I wrote down, it was 2015, I think, that we spoke. And at the end, there were a lot of academics in the audience. They'd done the evaluation, and one of them came up, stood up at the end, and said, "Do you mean that you're going to give control to the community?" And I'd like to believe that he did say, "You cannot be serious," but he wasn't. I'm not sure that he did, but that was what he was meaning. That this idea that you really are going to give control, ownership to the community, and that's what we do. Because it's not easy. It takes courage to give away control. It means you're giving away power. You have money, you have all of these things. You're coming in from the outside, you have power. And you're saying, no, we don't have power. You are in control. We make ourselves vulnerable. It's scary, to be honest. I think it's taken a long time for me to get used to this idea of trusting the community. Okay, so we believe that the community owns. The community will take control. How does the community take control in our approach? What we are looking to go from is the idea, we have a problem, can you help us? To, we have a problem, this is what we're going to do about it. And we call, the approach that we have is we give the community a process, a methodology that breaks down this challenge into very small steps. And we call this the community life competence process. It's a learning cycle. It is a cycle. It's not a, do it once and you're finished. It's a cycle of learning. It's doing and learning. And I think that's it's not that unusual. Learning cycles are fairly common. What we do in our implementation is that we work with the community to move from thinking about what are my weaknesses to actually concentrating what are my strengths. It's counterintuitive, but I think what I have learned is that communities are very well aware of their weaknesses, but very often they do not understand their strengths. And working so that within this cycle, people come to understand their strengths and they can begin to take action and they take ownership. I'd like to go back to the self-assessment in Nairobi. The most powerful one was in the Aga Khan Hospital. HIV/AIDS was a big issue. And we did a self-assessment and we brought together a group of people. The hospital brought together a remarkable group of people. And they did this self-assessment. And the self-assessment is about dialogue, it's about reflection, and it's about consensus. And we had all these wonderful people from the hospital, and we actually had the consultant in charge. And we also had a porter. And the consultant in charge said, well, we are the best hospital in Nairobi. We are probably the best hospital in Kenya. We may be the best hospital in Africa. We are clearly level 5 here. And this porter said, he was very quiet and very shy, but he actually said, I don't think you understand the way this hospital works. I think you have a large number of people in this hospital who, when they are ill, or when they're worried about their status, they go and see the witch doctor. They go to the local system. They don't have anything to do with you. And it was just this amazing conversation. That consultant was just wonderful in that he listened and stimulated this dialogue. And that group of people at the end of the afternoon had developed an understanding of their situation and their weaknesses and their strengths and what they could do about it. And it was, what happened was truly, I still shiver at that thought. So I think that for me is the essence of this self-assessment, this self-evaluation. It's about dialogue, it's about listening, it's about respect, and it's about consensus. Our author Ritu, who you listened to there, said I really had to finish with one important point. This is about systemic change. We are saying communities own the change. Well, you have to go up. It's the facilitators have to recognize that the communities own the change. The NGO has to recognize that the facilitators own their work, and the NGO has to recognize, the community owns the change. And the donors are exactly the same. And you need to get that system working for the change to be, well, when it happens, it's remarkably powerful. There's lots more I could say, but those are my ideas. But the final point, who owns the response? The community owns the response. By hook or by crook, if you wish a change to be sustainable, you need the community to own that response. And Malu will talk more about that.
Yes, exactly. Also starting with a little movie, so.
exactement qui d'autre le problème était puis nous gagne un match comme ça qui d'autre perd 5-0 ça quand sont tout la bonne bien maintenant nous pas bien faire le handball pas l'entraîner aller.
So this short clip comes from a group, a community in Mauritius, football team, young boys. They're not following strictly that community life competence process that we saw. But their coach, the lady that you saw, is part of the SALT facilitation team. So what she does with her team is appreciate, support, listen, learn together. So she is not coming as a coach telling you failed to do this is why you lost 6-0. No, she asked that questions to the boys, and they knew really well what was wrong. And they knew that they would need to find a trainer if they were to become serious, and that they would need to become more confident of themselves as well and train. And true story, they won the next match. So that is what happens in a community when we apply appreciation and when we trust that people know very well for themselves what they can do and also what they cannot do, where they need external help, because we don't do away with, okay, community, you can do it, go. No, the community can also find out themselves where they need help, and that is then where service providers come in and where facilitators can link them to existing services. The picture that we see here, we saw it briefly in the movie as well. This is in Bangladesh, where our colleague Ritu is facilitating the process on behalf of the Global Fund for Children. And the yellow is the self-assessment done in the first year, so really at the start. What happened, the community, in this case a group of 6 NGOs, grantees from the Global Fund for Children, came together, developed their dream, developed the practices that they knew they needed to work on if they are to reach their dream. And then there is the self-assessment. The community sets the baseline. So there's not an outcome, someone coming to tell you this is your baseline. There's no academics coming there. No, the community says for these practices, and in this case they really were very modest. They said we are mostly on level 1, which in our terminology means that we know this is important, but we don't know at all where to start yet. And then around 1 year later, group came back. In the meantime, have taken the actions that they committed to. And now, celebration time, because we made progress. We are at level 3. Level 3 meaning we knew it was important, we have informed ourselves, and now we take action every now and then. Not yet on a rigorous base, but there's progress. So the community here also owns their own monitoring and evaluation. And that is our frame into this book, is around monitoring and evaluation. And the step of self-assessment is where the community really takes ownership also of monitoring and evaluation. And from the example that Phil gave, you can tell how crucial this conversation about self-assessment is. How important it is that the right people are in the room and that everyone is being listened to. If the partner was not found important enough, we would never know that the director wasn't completely right. So Ritu asked the people from the picture in Bangladesh what the self-assessment means for them. They compare it in the first citation. I think it's really interesting. The traditional monitoring and evaluation often comes as a requirement from outside, from a donor, from a sponsor who has a specific ID. Like, okay, I give you a bunch of money, this is what you're going to work on, and prove me that it was worthwhile, so prove me that you made progress. But here, in this case, they say our self-assessment wasn't about meeting someone else's expectation. It was about holding ourselves accountable, honestly and gently. It helped us realize how much more we could do if we worked together intentionally. So hence the importance of giving also ownership of the evaluation to the group who owns the issue that they are working on. So we heard a lot of the majority world, but community-led is not restricted to that. It's here, it's in London, very much alive. And it's also, I want to bring you to my home country, the Netherlands. This is in Amsterdam, where a whole complete new neighborhood was being built on where before was water. So literally the whole community came off the ground. And the municipality of Amsterdam was wise enough, I think, to invest in weaving connections in the neighborhood from that very beginning. 30% of the new habitants were non-Dutch people with a migrant and mostly refugee background. So building that common ground was an important step. And on the picture you see how that starts with conversations, bringing people together, inviting everyone largely, and ask people to invite others in as well, and discuss about what our strengths are, what our hopes are for, in this case, our neighborhood. And the people in that neighborhood built their common dream, which was becoming the happiest neighborhood of the Netherlands. So they had a good starting point. Then came the self-assessment, the moment of self-assessment. And one of the practices that was important for the people in the neighborhood, that they had to find themselves, was appreciation of each other. And when people came together to do that self-assessment, they thought, this is good. We are good people. Of course, we appreciate each other. Very bravely, some of the people with a refugee history spoke out at that moment, and they said, still something is bothering us here. So we are here together, but this project, this process is being framed as integration of refugees in our neighborhood. And this is not it. If we want to live together here, then we should let go of this label. So we are all neighbors, and every one of us wants to live in a happy neighborhood. So can we let go of the labeling? So they were brave to speak out, and the hosting community were very good in listening and accepting. That conversation was also very emotional. But that was also the moment of ownership, because it was then about us, we as a community. It's not you and I do something for someone else. And that is a moment, I think, of ownership where a facilitator can almost disappear. This is, now they can go ahead. They know what to do. Yazid in the corner is one of our colleagues who is a facilitator. He went back. This picture is taken 7 years ago. He went back last month because we were wondering how are they doing. So he came to this Syrian family. He was part of the process. All of them now have the Dutch nationality. The 2 boys are working. The girl studies medicine. And the parents are very active in the neighborhood, especially in welcoming new neighbors. So that's sustainability through ownership. And I think in the past 20 years, what we have learned, if it's in Kenya at the Aga Khan, or in Assam on immunization, or in Amsterdam on living together, it is that, you mentioned it as well, there is no universal solution, but there is a universal approach, and that starts with appreciation. So the link is not to the Mentimeter, this is to the Constellation website in case you are interested in more. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think we were going to invite Elene to come back up onto the stage, and thanks so much, Malu and Philip. Gunjan has been gathering your questions, which I know you've been submitting at a very high rate, and is going to, she can see them. We can't, but she can, I believe. And yes, so let's get cracking and see if there's a couple of questions we can respond
Yeah,
to.
we actually have a lot of questions. So I'm going to try and combine and, direct questions a little bit here. But before I do that, I will say that there was somebody who noted that 200 characters is too little for them to frame their question. I agree. So whoever that brave soul is, if you want to speak up and ask your question in the room, please feel free to do so. Do we have? Okay.
So my name is Fatima. I'm from Syria. I'm a student now at LSE. I'm doing international development and humanitarian emergencies. I have always wondered about development. What does it mean? What do we do? How do we support communities? And this is why I'm... Okay, hold on. Okay, this is why I always wondered about development. In Syria, I worked in field before. I worked with people directly. And I noticed that every time we go, we distribute food assistance or home gardening kits or fodder for animals and livestock. They always say this is not what we want, and this is why I'm here. I'm studying international development and I'm attending this event. I have two questions. This is why I couldn't frame them in 200 characters. First, in LSE, we have studied a lot about the critiques of the system, the humanitarian system, of the international organization system, of donors and their top-down approach. And even we studied localizations and the critiques of localization. So the first question is, how are these 9 dimensions avoiding to enhance that top-down approach? How are we negotiating with donors to actually give the ownership to people, to communities? Because I think this is one of the hardest steps, to make the donors trust that their money is actually going for something useful for the communities and for trusting the local communities. My second question is, how are these 9 dimensions work in highly polarized communities, like the situation in Syria now after the overthrow of the regime? Things are changing quickly, dynamically. People are affected with every little step in the... So how can we make sure we're actually helping people? How are these dimensions work to help people in these highly changing contexts? See, no way of 200 characters. But thank you for making me start.
Good, thank you so much. What I'm going to do is there are a couple of related questions. I'm going to combine those questions, make sure that everybody has one question to answer, and then we'll do one round, and then I'll come back with the next round. How's that? So I think Fatma's question, if I got the name correct, sorry, there's a little bit of a thing, but if I got your name correct, but there were 2 questions. One was, how do you convince funders, right, to trust in communities and to actually invest in that? And I see a couple of related questions around that already also in the chat, which is, especially at a time when there is so much of cuts in the ODA budgets around the world, how do you actually convince people to invest in community-led development? So that's one question that we do have, which I think is applicable. But a related question, Malu, for you is also around, M&E, how do you actually reconcile? Because funders often have expectations and, requirements. So how do you reconcile what they want and get them to see that it's more important to see how the community sees us and bring them into the evaluation process, right? So there's one around that. The second question was, again, around, what Fatima talked about was mostly in terms of the 9 dimensions, right? How did they actually ensure that they are not How do they work in highly polarized communities? There is a third question which I want to take up, and then we'll go into a set of answers. And that question is around, again, Marlo, for you. How long does a community life competency process take? Or is the timeline context dependent? So if we can start there, maybe Marlo start with the specific questions on constellation, and then Elene and Matt, I'll come to both of you on the more general question that was there. And then I can do the 9 dimensions or ship in.
Okay. Starting with the difficult one, how do you convince a donor? Very difficult. And in our conversations with donors, we say what we can promise is the process. We cannot promise the outcome. And in the best case, the donor is brave enough to go with that. And we explain why it is so important that a community takes ownership and how that in the end will save money, because once a community is what we called life competent, they will be able to take on new challenges also. And that is partly also a response to your question of new challenges that communities keep encountering. The process works towards communities that have found a methodology to tackle their issues. Often what we see when donors do their formal evaluation as well, and also in the example that Phil gave that we did in Assam, we were brought in to help improve the level of immunization. We took on that challenge, but we didn't start from immunization. With the question to the villagers was, what dream do you have for the children in your village? And there were various aspects of that dream, and immunization was one of them. And the communities, the villages made big progress on, for example, water and sanitation, because that was very important to them. Immunization was often not in their priority list, but since they were making so many progresses on the things that they wanted to work on, immunization was also brought in. And since men were much more involved in the health of their children now, they also took ownership of bringing their children to the health center. So by working on the issue that the community chooses, also other aspects that will also satisfy donor requirements will improve. And that's with that story, so far we can convince some donors and some we don't. Yeah.
Matt, if I can come to you around, again, the question of by and large, especially at the time of ODA cuts, how do you convince funders to invest in CLD processes and to give control? Elene, Matt.
Thanks. Yes. Great. You know what? Like let's we've relied for too long on funders and this model of funding from the global north going to the global south. So as the Aga Khan Foundation, one of the things we track in our civil society program is the amount of resources raised locally for local development. And in 2024, we tracked $12.4 million US raised locally by the civil society organizations that we work with to do work in their communities. And that's a lot of that is community contributions, and some of that's cash and some of that's in kind. It's also funding from local government, it's funding from local philanthropies and private sector in the countries that we're working. And $12.4 million US, if that was a grant, in 2024 alone, so for 1 year, annualized grant, that would have been our largest single global grant, and that's resources raised locally. Okay, so that then, there's of course there's value in getting funding from donors if you can get the donors to enable you to do what you want to do. But there are resources locally, and community-led development is all about finding, accessing, and using those resources locally. I just want to respond a tiny little bit on the polarized societies piece, because as you saw, my colleagues are working in Syria, and it is hard. It is hard. But community-led development is about being there through the thick and the thin, right? It's not just having great days and celebrating the great days. It's about being there when people are arguing with one another, when people are really upset about how the humanitarian resources have been distributed between community members, and going in there and sorting it out. It's not, what did Apurva say? It's not efficient, but it's about taking that extra time to be empowering, for sure.
I want to bring it back a little bit. Maybe this is what you were going to do too, Gunjan, but I do want to bring it back a little bit to the dimensions and talk about the power inequality. So, there's a section in the introduction on the book where we talk about localization and what the local means, and what often happens is that when you bring development to a local level, power structures are not necessarily always questioned, right? Power inequalities and power structures continue to be in play. And I think that is maybe one thing that the dimension of participation, inclusion, and voice is really what community development try to think through and try and dismantle, right? And asking questions around who's participating, who's not participating, who's included in the conversation, who's not included in the conversation, and to what extent do those included, excluded have voice, and to what extent are they choosing to use their voice and not using their voice, and to always be reflective on that. And I think that then comes back to the question around facilitation, right? Are facilitators constantly asking those critical questions to enable inclusion as truthful and meaningful inclusion? And then accountability is a wonderful dimension for me too, right? Because accountability is about the multi-directions where accountability takes shape. And maybe that hooks back to your question around funding too, right? To communicate to funders, listen, accountability practices will be there, right? We're not saying provide us funding and that's it, right? There will be trusting mechanisms built in, right? But it's going to be in all the different directions, right? Upward, left, right, center, downward, all those kinds of measurements. It's not that, and maybe Gunjan, you can speak to this too, but there's this, I think, often misperception that community development is you can do anything, right? It's like, okay, it's completely throwing the baby out with the bathwater, now everything goes. It's not that way, because we continue to advocate for monitoring evaluation processes to be in place. We continue to advocate for accountability processes to be in place. But it's who is involved in developing and shaping those processes. That is the key question, right? Who contributes their opinions to developing those processes that can maybe speak to the power question, but then also the funding component. And then I'll just say this too, as far as funding is concerned, we have to do better, and we are doing better in collecting the evidence to illustrate that community development has impact. And I think one very powerful evidence is the local mobilization of resources that Matt is talking about, right? The more we have evidence like that to show how community development functions, how it works, but also how it is impactful and how it is also sustainable, we will be able to, for lack of a better word, speak the language of funders, right? And get them to that. Gunjan?
Thank you. I am also just cognizant of time. I don't know how much more time there is, so I don't want to, I think you have all responded to it, but yeah.
You need to bring us home, Gunjan. Yeah. So these are really the last words, but we want to hear from you to close us out.
Yes. So we did have a lot of wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them, but Elene, Matt, and Philippe and Malo are in the room. I'm sure they'll be happy to hang out and answer questions. There were questions around the composition of the 100 people, who was involved in it, and how many were community leaders, how many were CBOs. And I just want to say, well, I would say 80% of the people involved were community-based and local organizations in designing the 9 dimensions. We did not go to community members. So we were working with organizations that work with communities, right? And I want to bring it home by actually answering one of the questions, because I think it's in a sense, to me, why this book launch, right? Or why this book was so critical. And the question was around, who did you develop the CLD framework for, and how did it evolve? I think that to me was the most remarkable part of this. When we were developing the CLD assessment tool and the framework, right? We thought it was for INGOs. We thought INGOs need to change the way they work. They need to understand and work with communities. They need to change their attitude to communities, and that's what it is. When the framework came out overnight, it had thousands of people using it. But the first people who began to use it were local governments and community-based organizations. We had never thought they would be using it, right? Because we kind of assumed that they were community-led as community-based organizations, and we assumed local governments would not be interested. But what we realized, and to me, that is the power of the framework, but that is the power of community-led development on this book, is the fact that because this tool, because this framework was designed with this 100+ people who included local government representatives, who were mostly local and community-based organizations, they had ownership over it, bringing it back to what you were talking about, Malo and Philippe. They had ownership over it, but they also recognized how important this was in the work that they were doing. And so they took it, right, to their work. And I think for me, the book, one of the remarkable things about the book has also been just this journey of understanding and learning with everybody, understanding what community-led development is and taking it forward. And that's exactly what CLD happens, how it happens in communities. When people come together, they see each other. They learn from each other, because we as human beings, as we come in contact with others, it's a natural process that we begin to see them as human, and we begin to understand and learn from them and appreciate them. That's what the team did to me, the collaborative team. That's what the team of the book did to me. That's what the book is. And I think at the end of the day, that is what community-led development is. It is about seeing, listening, respecting, and learning together and from each other. So thank you so much for joining us. And I hope the community continues to grow. It is a community like this that brought the book together, that brought the framework together. And I hope this gathering in London leads us to other things. Thank you, Matt.